All right. Well, good evening, everyone, and welcome to today's third webinar in this four-part series called People and Place, hosted by the Yellowstone Gateway Museum. My name is Diane Chalfant, and I'm a volunteer and board member of the Yellowstone Gateway Museum here in Livingston, Montana. Our museum is a tremendous resource for our community, and so much of it can be accessed online. Beyond these webinar programs, the Yellowstone Gateway Museum also offers a fascinating digital photo archives, online exhibits, and research services. So there's a lot offered through the museum. And if you're not currently a member, we encourage you to become a member and explore more about the cultural and natural history and heritage of Park County, Montana. In a moment, I'll introduce the museum's curator, Karen Reinhardt. But first, I'd like to go over a few housekeeping items so that you'll know how to participate in today's event. At any time during the webinar, you'll be able to submit your questions to today's presenter, Kelly Hartman. Your questions will be anonymous. To submit a question, just type it in the Q&A at the bottom of the control panel, and I'll read the questions and share them with our speaker at the end of her presentation. We will be recording this webinar, and we'll upload it to Yellowstone Gateway Museum's YouTube channel after the event, so you'll be able to go back and watch it again, or bring others into the fold and watch the program as well. And then finally, following the webinar, you'll have an opportunity to take a very short survey, and we'll use the survey results to help us to continue to improve the webinar series. So I hope you will stay and take that, that survey. I'd like to now introduce Yellowstone Gateway Museum's curator, Karen Reinhardt. Karen?
Thank you, Diane. Thanks for all of your hard work as well. Before I introduce tonight's speaker, we do have one more program in the series. Livingston and Park County, the early years with Paul Shea, is next Wednesday, April 28th at 7 p.m. Please register on Facebook or on our website. And for tonight's program, historian Kelly Hartman published A Brief History of Cooke City in 2019. And if you've ever lived in or visited Cooke City, you know that it is a special place, shaped by beauty, mining, neighboring Yellowstone National Park, and colorful characters. In her book and during the program, Hartman recounts the stories of people who actually lived and died in the valley. Kelly Hartman was raised in Silvergate, Montana, attending kindergarten through 8th grade in Cooke City in a one-room schoolhouse. She received her AA in art at Northwest Community College in Powell, Wyoming, and her BFA in painting from Western Oregon University in Mammoth, Oregon. In 2014, she began her museum career as the director of the Cooke City, Montana Museum during its opening year. In 2016, she began work as a curator of the Gallatin History Museum in Bozeman, Montana. Her second book was released in June 2020, Murder Along the Yellowstone Trail, The Execution of Seth Danner. She's also written 2 books since that time as well. Now, sit back, relax, and enjoy Montana history. Please welcome Kelly Hartman.
Okay, I'm just gonna share my screen here. Oops. All right. A question if I am still at Cooke. I surely have to stay at Cooke. My husband has done here so much work on his claims that we can't leave. I am very lonesome being so far remote of all civilization, but I have to stay as long as he is able to work. He might strike it still. Within 3
Kelly,
years. Oh,
Kelly, we don't see your screen yet.
oh, sorry about that. Let me see. Oh, did that do it?
Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thank you for letting me know.
Sure.
All right. Within 3 years of the initial discovery of gold, local newspapers were reporting an exodus of miners from Bozeman, Montana, about 130 miles away from Cooke City. Early speculation in the area immediately foreshadowed the unfeasibility of an effective method of transportation to the area. And if you've ever been to Cooke City, you kind of know what the landscape is like. The first discovery of gold was in 1870 by Horn Miller and a couple of other what were later known as old timers. They were initially there in 1870 looking for some kind of color, as they called it, gold, and they were chased off by Native Americans at that point. And they lost their horses before they can make the journey back to Bozeman. And the journey must have triggered some irritability, as Henderson noted, Dad and Horn quarreled about a dog, drew guns and knives. I cocked my gun and told them to stop quarreling, camped near East Fork. It took them a couple of days to get out, and they ended up not going back that year and decided to hang out in the Bozeman area, where they must have told a lot of other people, perhaps at bars, about the color that they had found up in the mountains. When they went back the next spring, they met up with 75 men that were also headed to the camp, or what would be the camp. The snow melt made things difficult. A lot of people did not realize that snow in Cooke City lasts well into the summer, especially up in the higher range of the mountains. So many ended up leaving, calling it a great humbug, not really looking for the gold that could have been there. I love this note from Henderson, who was one of the first miners on that original expedition to Cooke City. He says, "Cloudy and cold, lively times in camp. Some of the men threatened to take Miller and myself out to compel us to show them our diggings. We told them the first man that made a move towards forcing us would fall martyr to his foul and rash undertaking. This put a stop to further threats." Not only was Cooke City difficult to get to, and the snow melt a bit of a hindrance during the summers, but it was also in 1872, just a few years after the discovery of gold in Cooke City, that Yellowstone National Park was established. And this establishment effectively cut them off from the Bozeman area and that method of transportation to there, and made them trespassers anywhere in the park boundary. Today, the park butts up almost 4 miles away from where they were looking for gold, so that doesn't give them a lot of room to work in. Horn Miller, one of the first discoverers of the area, worked quite closely with Superintendent Norris on trying to discover a good way for the miners to be able to get their goods out to the market. And he also looked to Miller as a way of learning more about the park, because these old timers, or what would be old timers, they were young at the time, they knew a lot about the land and the landscape. And so people like Norris really depended on people like Miller to show them what features were in the park, because they'd been all over it. However, in 1877, when things were starting to look up between the park, Norris, and just trying to figure out how miners could get gold out, the Nez Perce took flight through the park. At the time, it doesn't seem like a whole lot happened really in the Cooke City area, but later articles in the 1920s and 30s would say that the miners were prepared for a battle, and that the Nez Perce would come through and like burn down their smelter and take all of their gold and their bullion to make bullets. However, no articles that I could find at the time of the actual Nez Perce flight reported any such incidents, leading one to believe that time has led to a false accusation being made against the fleeing group, an exaggerated story of perseverance created on behalf of the miners. And much of this would have been in the name of tourism of the 1920s. Sitting in Philadelphia in 1870, Civil War financier J. Cooke had his mind on tourism and the development of the Northern Pacific Railway, in which his firm, J. Cooke and Company, was heavily invested. That would be in 1870. However, in 1873, J. Cooke would be involved in the Panic of 1873. In fact, he would be the one that caused the panic and effectively caused the Northern Pacific to have a complete upset, as he was pretty influential in their operations. However, by 1880, Jay Cooke had earned a lot of his wealth back due to investment in the Horn Silver Mine in Utah. So by the 1880s, about 10 years after they originally were hoping for something from Jay Cooke, he again shows back up in Bozeman newspapers and such, and in the conversation with Cooke City. And it would actually be on June 11th of 1880 that the camp would receive its name, proudly establishing a connection with a promising future. They would name their city Cooke City. There was talk at that time of Jay Cooke and company potentially coming to the area to check to see if there would be good investments there, hence the naming of the town in that particular year. In fact, Jay Cooke Jr., not Jay Cooke Sr., just Jay Cooke Jr. was to be headed out to Utah. And they decided that they would like to take a detour and visit Yellowstone National Park, mostly just to experience it. And since it was pretty much brand new, and they figured that they might as well check out these mines on their way. They did come prepared. They brought surveyors, lots of mining equipment. They definitely were interested in the Cooke City mines. However, if they hadn't been located next to Yellowstone National Park, they probably wouldn't have come. There was one lady who came on the trip, Mrs. Elton Head. She was the wife of one of the surveyors. And I think she has one of the best quotes about what it would have been like to see Cooke City for the first time in 1880. She writes, "One day at sunset, the last hill was made and a deep little creek known as Crandall Creek sighted. 2 logs were thrown across for a bridge and was just wide enough for 1 pony at a time. So one by one, the outfit trotted up the grassy road past 3 cabins with no windows, no people, no anything, save the encircling mountains, the song and chirping of the birds, the wind in the treetops. Up the road a little farther still, a tiny park about 3/4 of a mile long, 4 wide. 1 solitary log cabin was there, and the end for a season was reached. For this quiet, deserted place was Clark's Fork, and the cabins were Cooke City." While the group was there, they looked at quite a few mines, did a lot of survey work. Jay Cooke Jr. himself only stayed about a day or so before heading out to see Yellowstone and heading down to Utah and then back east. However, the Elton Heads did stay for the whole season. They stayed until that fall when the snow started to fly. And actually, one of the coolest things she talks about is when she goes to move into this one cabin, they didn't have any windows at all. And so she demanded that she have windows to be able to live there that summer. And so when they did leave, when the snow flew, Mrs. Elton Head really does show that in her reminiscence of this, that this was a special place for her, as I think most people think it is. And she writes, "Then the wheels began to turn, the engine puffed, the whistle, and the summer was over, but never the memory of the wonderland, nor the mountains, nor the rivers winding like silver ribbons through the fir trees, as seen from some great divide. Never the memory of the people of the territory, who evinced then the same qualities which they now show as a state, fair-mindedness, progressiveness, and kindness to one and all who come within their borderland." One of the things that would deter Jay Cooke Jr. from really wanting to follow up what they did discover there, because they were happy with some of the gold findings that they found. But the biggest problem was it was still part of the Crow Reservation. So not only do you have the difficulty of transportation, you have the difficulty of having Yellowstone National Park right there. It was also part of the Crow Reservation. So technically, many of the claims in that area couldn't actually be claimed. He couldn't have purchased them. So a couple stories about early life in the mining camp. People came anyway, despite some of the news that maybe Jay Cooke Jr. wasn't as interested. People were still excited. They still saw it as something great. And with that comes, more people, more stories, more funny stories, and more people taking advantage of other people. And one of my favorite stories is about an old timer who really plays it on this New Yorker. So this entrepreneur sends this guy out to check out a couple of mines, and the representative purchases the mines and then hires this old timer, planning to pay him $4,500, which is quite a sum, to dig a length of tunnel into his mine 225 feet long. And this old timer is paid $1,000 on the spot to do this job. And so he says, sure, I'll do it. And so he goes up there and he timbers the outside of a tunnel, and then puts a couple like rail links in there so that you could have like an ore car in there, and then strews about some debris. And then in January, he calls or writes to the representative and says, all right, your tunnel's done. Come on out and check it out. So the representative arrives, and the old timer says, well, I don't want you to dirty your shoes, so I'll take a length of rope 225 feet long, and I will go to the end of the tunnel, and I will hit my hammer when I'm at the bottom end of it, and you'll know that I dug as far as you wanted. And so he goes in and does that, and he gets paid the remainder of $3,500. And so the representative feels great. He goes back east. He comes back in the summer, thinking that, all right, now we're going to start working on this mine. And he discovers that his mountainside, his little piece of property, is just strewn with these logs and all this debris, because the old timer had actually only dug about 25 feet, and tricked the guy into thinking he dug the whole way. He just dug into the snow. He never dug into the mountainside. So there's quite a few stories like that of things that happened in those early days. And again, it didn't deter anybody from coming. People from Bozeman were coming all the time. In one instance, they said 1,000 stampeders were coming from the Bozeman area. Many of them would turn back as they would discover that there's snow, till much later than they expected. However, things really did change in 1882. It was a big year for the camp, as the provisions of the Crow Treaty changed, and that tract of area was ceded from the Crow Indian Reservation. And so that allowed all of the miners actual claim to what they had there. And it was kind of a nutty time for a little bit. There were lots of people claim joping and things like that during that time, but it made Cooke City official. So even though it had been a city or a town, nobody knows it really as a city, but it had been a town since 1880, but it couldn't be officially a town until 1882, when that land was changed. And I love this map because it really shows how many claims were in that area. This is from 1908, and on this map are 300 claims marked, and there were actually 3,000 in the area at the time. So this is just a very small percentage of what the mining industry would have been like there. Many of them were owned by small individuals, and eventually through the 1900s, a lot of those would be bought up by larger companies. It was also during this time, in 1886, that one of the first pioneers of the area passed away, George Houston. He was only in his 40s, but it still marks a slight change in the area. And I love this quote that somebody had written about him in Livingston Enterprise. It says that he was greatly led by impulse and would starve himself before he would see anyone else want. He made money easily and spent it freely and generously in a thoroughly Western style. And I feel like that's something that could be said of Cooke City today, of how generous and kind people can be, even though it seems kind of a gruff area. If you need something, they're there for you. Receiving mail in the winter was, of course, a necessity, especially as more mining companies moved in. It became more important to be able to communicate with the outside world. And along with having mail service, you also have people who have to traverse this landscape in the winter. Mining continued in the winter, which is pretty amazing. So some of the places where they already had mines in place, they just continued to tunnel into the snow and then continue digging into the mountainside. And this could be extremely dangerous. On New Year's Day in 1887, two miners, Tony Wise and Edward Martin, lost their lives in the avalanche that occurred at one of the mine sites. Nick Tredenick was one of the men. He was a foreman at the time, and he was able to escape the avalanche, but saw what had happened and knew who had been buried. And they didn't find them until the spring. But they're all buried in the Cooke City Cemetery, which is what this is a picture of. So the battle for a railroad kind of officially began in the mid 1800s. Before then, it was something that was of course it was eventually going to happen, but it really didn't become a battle until then. And a lot of it had to do with the issues of Yellowstone National Park, which was one of the most viable ways to get a railroad through to that area. In 1805, Congressman John Joseph O'Neill of Missouri, who was against the railroad, would be quoted as saying, "This nation has only got one park, and I want to see it let alone. There is a little block of land, 55 or 60 miles in size, all that Uncle Sam has retained for the enjoyment of the people, and you folks can't keep your hands off that." So that was one way of looking at the railroad. Another way, they were considering the Clark's Fork Canyon area, but it was a route that seemed plausible to people who were back east, like that congressman, who wouldn't necessarily be looking at the terrain, but anybody who lived here would think, how in the world would you get a railroad through Clark's Fork Canyon and up to Cooke City? So there was actually an engineer, though, who did make a partial survey of that area, and he was quoted as saying that it was better adapted for natural scenery than a natural railroad grade. So that was never really a viable option, but it seemed viable to people in the government who didn't want to have to deal with figuring out how to get a railroad through Yellowstone National Park. And those actually living in Cooke City really didn't care where it came from, or even that it was a railroad. They were also looking for a decent wagon road. And so they were kind of stuck in the middle of all of this litigation. And then this is a quote from a writer who anonymously named himself Quartz, who would report to Livingston Enterprise. He was out of Cooke City. And he said, "The question of how to overcome excessive freight rates has with us been a serious one. It cannot be denied that the development and subsequent progress of Cooke has in consequence been unjustly retarded. So much so, in fact, it is becoming a matter of general regret that our products cannot go to help swell the grand total of the output of the territory." So they were just really struggling with being able to take out more than just kind of enough to take care of one person. They wanted to do a bit more with industry. They wanted to create more of a business, corporations, and it couldn't be done on that scale. However, people were forever optimistic despite everything that was happening in Washington. They continued to attract miners and investors and politicians to the area. And that is really quite remarkable, considering like if you'd actually been there, imagining that it could boom, you know? And so this is a really great postcard image of Cooke City kind of in those early days. And you can see the mountains are right there. It makes it very difficult to imagine bringing anything up through that valley. They did have one wonderful spokesperson in their favor. In 1889, as that year drew to a close, Professor G.C. Swallow, who was the territorial mine inspector of Montana, he began writing articles on behalf of Cooke City and getting a railroad to that area. And he was quite influential. His writing was beautiful. So I want to read to you one of the things that he wrote about Cooke City that if as you listen, just imagine like how much that would inspire you to really be behind these miners in Cooke. He writes, "The people who discovered, developed, and hold the mines of this district with a firm belief in their vast wealth belong to that intelligent and vigorous and patriotic portion of Americans who have finished up the states of the Atlantic slope, made those of the Mississippi Valley, and are now laying broad and deep the foundations of the great commonwealths of the Pacific slope and the Rocky Mountains. The world has never seen the equal of this people. 10,000 times more efficient than an army with banners have been these bands of working men and working women in their quiet but never wavering march from the Alleghenies to the Pacific, taking with them their household goods, their plows, their picks and shovels, their schools, and their churches. Behind it sprang up farms which feed the world, cities and railroads, what they call civilization. And from it poured out the streams of gold and silver and copper and lead, which have vitalized and made permanent the financial condition of this country. So Swallow was really behind the miners and their plights, because they had been there kind of before the park, but were just stuck in just really bad timing. One of the things that a lot of people discuss when talking about Yellowstone National Park, there were a couple different options. One was to potentially segregate a portion of the park. They were going to follow kind of a river line and take that portion out, and the railroad could go on the opposite side of the river. However, this wasn't pleasing to people. They liked the shape of the park as it was, which, according to Swallow, a square wasn't natural anyway, so why not follow a river? The boundaries were also difficult for people who hunted in the area. Remember, this is a time when a lot of people hunted just to survive. And it was difficult for people to know which side of the park boundary they were on, which also made it difficult for the Army, which at that time was taking care of the park. So to have a river boundary seemed like it made a lot of sense, because that would be a little bit more obvious for everyone. But one of the things that people were worried about is that Soda Butte Cone would be on the wrong side if they were to segregate a portion of the park. And according to Swallow, it's kind of tongue in cheek, but he talks about how he has a contract with someone who can move the Soda Butte Cone to the other side of the river if it's going to be that big of a problem, so that people visiting the park can still see it in all of its glory. He also talks about it being completely trampled over and it doesn't work, and it's going to be gone anyway soon. And it's just funny that 130 years later now, it's still a site that people like to go see in the park. So it didn't leave, that's for sure. So one of the kind of people against the railroad also was Congressman Francis B Stockbridge. And he was opposed to the road to Cooke City because somebody would make money out of it. And the Livingston Enterprise, who is definitely behind the Cooke City miners, went on to retort, "Who ever heard of an enterprise of any kind calculated to develop the country that did not originate with a view to money making? What other incentive is there for instigating public enterprises?" So there's a lot of different viewpoints to what is happening, which I find quite interesting. And a lot of towns like Livingston and Bozeman getting behind the miners in Cooke City, but Washington was just so far away and they just couldn't quite see how the terrain worked. Life went on in Cooke City. It also ended for a lot of people. In the 1880s, George Fisher had arrived in the Cooke City area. He ended up kind of sticking to him by himself, had his own mine that he worked on by himself. And in 1900, there were women in the area who were attempting to get money for him because he had spent time in the Civil War. So they were trying to get a pension for him, but they had difficulty as he had two names. As you can see by the headstone in this photograph, his other name was Jacob Bach. We knew him as George Fisher in this area. Sadly, in 1916, Fisher was found dead in his cabin at Cooke City, and a newspaper would report the following. With $500 in money on the table before him, and a contract for the sale of his mining properties for $17,000 clutched in his hand, the body of George Fisher, an old prospector of the Cooke City district, was found by neighbors who missed him from his usual haunts. Fisher had shot himself in the temple. It is believed he thought he had parted with his mines at too low a figure. Fisher always believed his mines had a great future and that he would someday be enormously wealthy. He willed all his money and effects to a friend. He was unmarried and, so far as known, had no relatives. So that's one of the sad stories of life lived and dying in a mining camp. A lot of people were just waiting for that big strike, but then, and someone like that, maybe that's all they were waiting for. And once that happens, it's kind of over for them. There's also a couple of funny stories about things that happened in the area. Everything had to be freighted in over course, we didn't have a railroad line, so everything was from a wagon. And in 1892, a freighter named Pritchard was transporting a load of goods from the Soda Butte station into Cooke City, and it included a lot of alcohol, which he partook of. And on the way to Cooke City, his horse threw him, and he broke his leg. He ended up laying there overnight before he was discovered and cared for, and it was supposed that he would probably lose his leg. So there's a lot of danger in living in this area and not being able to get help. So something as simple as breaking your leg can become something quite tragic. There's also a story of this guy who wanted to take the mail into Cooke City, and he'd never been there before, and it was winter. And for some reason, the regular mail carrier couldn't make it. And so they said, sure, you can go ahead and do it. He didn't make it past Blacktail Drive area as he got lost in a snowstorm and a blizzard. Eventually people went to him, and it was supposed that he was going to lose a couple of limbs as well due to frostbite. He was lucky to be alive, but people just didn't realize like how there's nobody out here, and you really have to take care of yourself. There are also some really great typical Western kind of gunfight stories in Cooke City. And this one was one of my favorites, just because it was so classic of everything that came out in the trial and the newspapers of what had happened. But basically, there was a stranger in town, James Malloy, who was potentially a soldier, maybe from kind of the Bozeman area. And something had come up about a horse. Somebody had touched somebody's horse. And it was a bit of an issue for William Chick, the other gentleman. And the Standard reports the following. Chick and Malloy were standing in front of the store, and Chick drew out a large butcher knife and said to Malloy, "You blank blank, I'll cut your liver out and feed it to the buzzards." Malloy said, "I want you to leave me alone, as I don't want any trouble." Chick then shifted the knife to his left hand, reached under the left side of his coat with his right, and drew a revolver and started towards Malloy, again repeating his threat. Malloy grabbed a rifle that stood against an empty oil can, jumped off the porch, and started to retreat backwards. Chick said, "You coward, you're afraid to fight," and jumped off the porch, took a step two forwards, and fired at Malloy, who then retreated about 30 feet. As soon as Chick fired, Malloy drew the rifle to a level with his hip and fired. Chick fell with the gun in his hand. Malloy then said, "Someone take his gun and I will give up." So in the end, Malloy actually got off. He was a free man after that. They did have a trial, but he came back not guilty, as there were so many people who were witnesses and saw the other guy take the shot first. But so did Cooke City play into the theme of the Wild West. The railroad saga would continue. So now we're up to about the 1890s. In that era, there was a petition that was passed around in local towns, including Livingston and Bozeman, trying to raise some support for the miners. And it was also during that time, early in 1892, that Alvin P. Vintage was, who was a local resident of the Cooke City and Bozeman area, was sent to Washington to support Senator Wilberforce Sanders' segregation bill of a portion of Yellowstone National Park. And for months, it was quite exciting because people really thought something was going to happen since they had a representative there. And the Anaconda Standard dramatically states that surely in years to come, when the history of Montana is written, there will be no people so much to be pitied or lionized as heroes in all its thrilling early days as those of Cooke City, who have toiled and waited and still toil and wait for relief from a government that seems utterly deaf to their appeals. The battles with natives will pale before the long wage battles that Cooke people have waged against an unscrupulous lobby whose personal gains are all they work for. What is to be the end, who can tell? So while this whole saga is happening, and as people are going to Washington and things are happening and all these different routes are considered, there's still a lot going on in Cooke mining wise. It was said that after a new cyanide mill came in the late 1880s, early 1890s, that $1,000 a day was the output of one of the mills, and expenses were not much more than $100 a day. and that particular company planned to accumulate a gold brick worth 12,000 to place on exhibit in the Livingston Bank. By April 1893, 40-pound bricks had left the cyanide mill. However, it was still hard to get ore out of the area, and for the most part, it was very difficult for large, more difficult ore to be broken down. A lot of this would have been like the simpler stuff to get to, which was taken out, but there was a lot more that just needed more processing. And a lot of that processing would have been better outside of Cooke if it could have been taken somewhere whole, and that just wasn't possible without a railroad in the area. However, in 1900, things really started to boom when Dr. G.L. Tanzer of Seattle and the new World Smelting Company arrived on the scene. He would be there for about the next 20-something years trying to make something out of Cooke City. In his first early years, he would attempt to create New World City, which would be about where Cooke Pass is today, roughly a mile from actual Cooke City itself. And he had planned to create a new city up there. There was water available in that area. And so he actually did create a flume system that would create electricity for both the mines and for his city and for Cooke City as well. So he had quite a bit that he was proposing. And this is one of the newspapers that they created. As far as I know, there's only one issue, but it's great. It really shows what the plans were, how they were going to take care of everything. A lot of reports on the types of minerals to be found, although a lot of it is quite scientific, as Tanzer was a scientist, so a little bit difficult to read. But prospectors at the time would have understood kind of what he was talking about. And that was something that was also sent out to potential investors. However, it wouldn't be until after World War I that anything could really start to happen in that area. So Tanzer really did stick it out for quite some time, trying to get capital, trying to get people interested. The tram line from Aldridge actually came to Cooke City for use in his operations, which is pretty cool. He did construct many buildings as well. The flume was constructed and electricity was operated from it. But in 1927, Tanzer suddenly died while on a trip to Germany, and that kind of ended it. He was really the main force behind it. His son had been in the area, but had kind of had a panic attack and went insane, and so was not interested in anything in Cooke City. And so one of the biggest operations just kind of halted right there. And unfortunately, later on, when people investigated some of the buildings, a lot of the equipment had never been opened. So it hadn't lived up to its potential at all. And one of the, I think, most compelling and most personal for me stories is about the Zookers, who lived in Cooke City. And like many, their years of waiting were filled with, digging in their mines and just trying to make a living. Anna worked in some of the boarding houses and such in the town, and Anton pretty much just worked on his mine. It was a very long mine. It was about 300 feet, all dug by hand, and he had to stoop to go in because you only could afford so much dynamite and afford so much energy in digging back into it. So it was a low mine. In the 1920s and 30s, a lot of people became really interested in the people of Cooke City. I think part of it, and actually in the West in general, it became kind of popular to talk about the West. You're looking at a time period when people are excited about Hemingway coming out here and things like that. The West, it was still kind of here, there's still these old timers here. And so a lot of articles came out about people in Cooke City, and two of them actually featured the Zookers, both in a very sad light. So the Zookers were Bohemian immigrants who had come to America in the 1880s. They had gotten married in 1890 in America. They met here. It's uncertain if they knew each other before then. But by 1900, they were living in Cooke City, and it's there they would remain for the rest of their lives, pretty much. And so these articles really show them as these people who are just so intent on finding the ore at all costs. Like, they don't want to leave. It talks about Anastasia Zooker, like, crying out that she'd rather die than have to leave her mind, because it's going to happen. You know, they're gonna strike it rich. And so we have these photographs at the museum of the Zookers, and I mean, she's a pretty imposing woman, for sure. And reading those articles, it felt so like, oh, I don't know, it just kind of had a weird vibe to it. And then while I was working at the Cooke City Museum, this one woman came in and she said, I think I have a letter from her to Isabel Holland. And she sent those to me, and it changed absolutely everything, because the people that were written about in those articles, that's not at all how they were. So these two letters were written by Anastasia Zooker, and in one of them, she writes, I not wonder to you that you are longing to be back in Cooke. It was at that time a virgin place where you were born, and there was more people at Cooke at that time than it is now. For summer, there come quite a few visitors, especially when the picnic occurred. If some company would start some real work, there would be more life at Cooke. Of course, I'm young folks, but I wish to be out of Cooke. And she goes on to talk about wanting plums so that she can make plum dumplings, because that would have been part of her heritage. And it's just so different than the people who were portrayed in the article. And that really got to me, that this poor woman was kind of trapped in this area, and she wouldn't leave because her husband, this was his life. It's all that they knew. On August 27th, 1934, Anton passed away in Livingston. And the next year, shortly after, Anna was moved to Warm Springs. She wasn't crazy. She was just elderly, and there was no place for her. So she actually passed away in Warm Springs, nearly 250 miles from where she had spent a majority of her life, and over 5,000 miles from where she was born. And they're not buried together. Anton is buried in Livingston, and she's buried in Warm Springs. And that's always just been a really important story for me. But you know, as the Red Lodge picket proclaimed, have courage, Cooke. The fruition of long cherished hopes seems almost within your eager grasp. The Zookers no doubt held on to that hope, because there was a railroad in sight. So in the early 1900s, Horn Miller and Pike Moore and some of those early old timers had passed away. So it was a new era, kind of. And Mr. Noble, who was pretty prominent in Cooke City mining operations, was quoted as saying, "Cooke City will be all right. We expect the Burlington to build our way sometime during the coming summer, and at present, the government is building an excellent wagon road into the district for the traffic. The camp will yet be a record breaker, and I am satisfied to have pitched my tent there." However, due to all of these attempts, nothing really happened. Even though there was such hope in the 1920s, when you read the articles, they really thought it was going to happen. However, the world and the area had kind of started to turn towards something new. They started to turn to tourism. It was during this time that the Beartooth Highway, then known as the Black and White Trail, was progressing up from Red Lodge. So by this point, as many of you know, the railroad never came. Despite all attempts, schemes, and routes, the Iron Horse never arrived to aid in the plight of the miners. With the park route blocked by litigation and all other routes implausible due to the terrain and costs, the miners of Cooke were left as they were. Little ore was taken from the valley, and few made it out rich. The new era was tourism. During the 1920s, while some of the old timers were still alive, they had a lot of fish fries, and in 1941, it was estimated that 5,000 people actually came to the fish fry to see some of the old timers and see what the Wild West was really like. We have a film at the museum that features some of those that was done by the Northern Pacific, and in one of those, Anna Zooker is in there, and she turns and smiles at the camera, and that was really amazing to see her in movement. Silvergate was born in 1932, and this Silvergate would kind of come into the era of tourism quite a bit earlier than Cooke City, just because they were like built for it. There were a town specifically built to house people and to bring in tourists. and thinking more about Yellowstone National Park as an economic base rather than mining. Cooke City would eventually come along to see it that way, but it took a little bit longer. The amazing thing about Silvergate is pretty much all of the same wood buildings are still there that were part of the original 1932 plan. So today, Cooke City still survives on ebbs and flows, although they are now steadier and more expected. Spring brings tourists, and the busy summer season sees over 250,000 visitors pass through the same old Main Street as decades past. Fall offers a brief respite before the snowmobilers and wolf watchers flood the area for the winter. In recent years, new construction has also been booming as people from across the United States seek a place of beauty and refuge to call their home. The times are ever changing, but the themes remain the same. It seems everyone in Cooke City is still waiting for the visitor to come in search of this new gold, the constant beauty to be found in the landscape, and the life lived between the mountains. And I'd just like to finish with one quote from 1917 from Gertrude Zerb that I think really captures the beauty of this area. She says, "Perhaps after all, the real play has not yet begun. Meanwhile, the lakes ripple on in the endless mountain breeze, the waterfalls roar in the canyons, the purple mountains glow in the sunrise. The picturesqueness of this little lost city is not desecrated, not yet." So I do have my book available on my website, mountainstudio308.com. And if you buy it from there, it comes autographed. Also, authors get a bigger proceed when you buy from them directly. And I also have my book, Murder Along the Yellowstone Trail, The Execution of Seth Danner, as well on there. And I also have my two next books, Wicked Bozeman and Murder and Mayhem in Gallatin County, both available for pre-order there as well.
Kelly, thank you so much. That was a fascinating program. It was great to see those images, but it was what you said about the images that really brought those people to life. So that was great. Do we have any questions from our audience today? Just type them in the Q&A and we'll share them with Kelly. Well, I have a question for you while we're waiting, and that is, how do you feel growing up in Cooke City and attending a one-room schoolhouse through 8th grade affected your career as both a writer and an artist?
Yeah, I think it really did. Because in a way it's almost like being homeschooled, but not, because it's a little bit more like community based, a little bit closer, which I think was great. I did have a very hard time in high school. That was not a great time for me because of that, because I came from a different background and was just a little bit different. But I think I've found as I've come into my 30s that I've actually gone back. Like, high school took a little bit to get over it, and then it's like, well, none of that matters. And this was so beautiful, and I learned so much then, that I'm really starting to appreciate having grown up there. And it definitely inspired, well, my artwork for one. Everything that I do is based on nature, because of growing up there. And then writing as well. I really felt like when I was working on the Cooke City book, because my parents are wildlife photographers, so we didn't grow up learning about the mining industry. Like, it just wasn't really a thing. So getting to learn about the heritage is something very different that I grew up in this area and I didn't know. And then getting into like these stories of people that nobody had really heard about. Right. I think that's where I connect to the most. I've always said, like, I couldn't write a book about John Bozeman. Everybody knows him, but these people that nobody's really talked about, I think that's really special. And I think some of that does come from growing up there and meeting different types of people very briefly as we go through.
Wow. Let's see. Well, we've got several questions that have come up. The first one is, was there a brothel in Cooke City?
I'm sure that there was. I've definitely heard it rumored that I always call it the big White House in Cooke City. It's still sort of standing. Could have potentially been one, but it's kind of hard to say. It was so small, there really wasn't like a red light district. I think it was probably most of the boarding houses would have potentially had something like that. But I never found anything super conclusive. I think part of that is that you don't have anything quite like a Sanborn map or anything like that to go back on and start to point out things, sorts of operations as you do in a big town. But I'm sure it happened.
Yeah. There was another question about mining, and that is regarding the people that were successful at mining. Was it individuals or was it small corporations?
Mostly individuals. Most of the corporations were looking for something a little bit bigger and to get more ore out. In order to do that as well, to get more out, you needed more equipment there so that you could break it down more, which means more investment. And a lot of times it didn't go as planned. There's one instance where they'd ordered equipment and it sat outside of Gardner forever. I mean, like for months and months and months, almost a year before they could actually get it in because the roads were bad and it was so difficult to move things. So most of the people who would have done well would have been individual miners, and a lot of them didn't stay in the area. There's very few that did. So I'm guessing if you did well, you got your money and you left. So hard to track them.
And just compliments on the stories, quotes, and photos. Nice job.
Thank you.
I have a couple questions for you, Kelly. I wondered if you had uncovered any stories about women who were either mining, besides the one woman that you highlighted, or women who were business owners, perhaps other than the red light district that you didn't uncover. Were there other women that were involved?
Definitely, yeah. Not a whole lot in the mining necessarily. There were definitely some women. Nick Tredenick, the one who had witnessed those men die in the avalanche, his wife lived in the area with him. So although he was he wasn't necessarily a miner, he was a little bit higher up. So there weren't a whole lot of women necessarily that would have been mining, but a lot of the boarding houses in town would have been run by women with their husbands, but their husbands would have a lot of other interests in the town. So we know how they basically ran the place. One of them, Jack Allen, his wife, you see her in all the pictures, and John Curl, his wife, was there. And then later on, when you get to like the 1930s, you have the Nordquists, who had quite a bit to do with the Elbarty ranch and that area, but she actually owned a hotel in the area. So I feel like that's more the era where you start to see a lot of women, but again, women are really hard to track. There aren't a whole lot of census details from them. So it's difficult to find them for sure. So to have a letter from the Anna Zooker like that was pretty special.
Thank you. And then my daughter has a question about religious and social life in Cooke City. What was it like there? How did people entertain themselves, or were there churches?
There were a lot of bars, a lot for a small town. There were a ridiculous amount of bars. I don't quite understand how they could have all like kept up a good business since there were so many of them, especially during the winter months. I can't imagine. But I think that was the biggest form of entertainment, is just kind of coming down off the mountain and hanging out and talking about, what you saw or what was happening up there. As for churches, I didn't come across a whole lot early on. Later on, they definitely do, especially as you come into like that tourism era of the 20s and 30s, when people are looking for a bit more, and you have more families in the area, things like that. But yeah, socially, that of course the fish fries every year, those went on for about 30 years. Those were huge. Everybody wanted to go to those. So that was kind of the big end of the year in the fall kind of activity that would happen. And I'm sure there were things before then that would have been similar kind of get-togethers before, because most people left for the winter because it was difficult to mine during the winter months. So you kind of have a little get-together and then disperse and then come back.
Great, thank you.
Kelly, more compliments from your audience here, including someone who has known you since you were a young person, and your knowledge of the area is phenomenal, and another person who just ordered your book. And so, great, thanks. Are there any other questions from the audience? You can use that Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Let's see. More compliments, Kelly. Great job. Give it another minute.
I can talk a little bit too about, I was able to present at, I never pronounce it right, but I believe it's Pachachka, I think, at the Ellen Theater in Bozeman. And there were, I think 2,000 people attended it. You basically get 5 minutes to tell a story.
Oh my gosh.
I told the one on Anna Zucker, and well, I cried on the stage just because it's such a powerful thing to me. Just to be able to tell her story. But that was amazing to be able to express such a small story. A woman who nobody knew about at all to that wide of an audience was amazing. So it's great to have opportunities like that to share people's lives, because they lived extraordinary lives. Amazing.
Let's see here. Oh, okay. Here's a question. Can you tell us a bit more about your upcoming books? Are they history focused?
Yes. Yes. So I work at the Gallatin History Museum, and it's housed in the old Gallatin County Jail. Hence my interest in things like murder and mayhem is all stemmed from that. Some of the jail cells are still there. So it's for me been a way to kind of reconcile being in a building that has such a history like that. That's particularly why I wrote about the execution of Seth Danner, because the gallows still exist in the building, and I wanted to know more about the story. And in exploring that, I came across all of these other murders and different crimes that happened. So I wanted to write a bit more about that. We have the original jail records to go back to, which is pretty amazing. But each book basically goes from the early days of Bozeman and Gallatin County and goes through about 1930. And the first book, Wicked Bozeman, goes through other crimes other than necessarily murder. So most of it is things like embezzlement, robbery. I've got insanity, a really big chapter on insanity. Turned out there's a lot about that. And then the second book, Murder and Mayhem in Gallatin County, is more murder based, and some really interesting stories there. I walk home and tell my parents about all these horrible things that happened every day. But so many of them are so interesting. Some of them people know about, some of them haven't really been, looked at since they happened originally. So that's what all of those are about. And I always try to, as I did with the Cooke City book, find some humor and find some of the levity and things as well, even if they're difficult topics. I kind of see it all in there, and really look for the story of the people that's in there.
Well, I've got a bunch more that have come in. Maybe Karen and I can alternate with these questions. But one person commented that he'd heard about a skier who came up Stillwater and over Daisy with the mail. So one way to get in with the mail.
Yes,
Interesting.
yeah, definitely. He was actually a Norwegian skier that would come over, and there was one kind of cool story where he had a brand new puppy that he was training with him, and an avalanche occurred, which I'm sure happened quite frequently, and he had to outrun it. And as he's out-ski it, as he's out skiing it, he feels something like around his neck, and it was the puppy had his claws around his neck, and they both escaped fine. But that's a great story.
Wow. Karen, you're muted.
There we go.
There you go.
Thank you. Another question. Are there any festivals or other practices from the early days that are still practiced there today?
I don't think that there really is. Something like the fish fry would be really cool to reinstate. I feel like it is something that's kind of coming back as an interest again. These things kind of come in waves. as people like look at different things to be interested in. Yeah, there's not really a whole lot that really carried over. I think there are a few things that occur. Honestly, my family and I are a little antisocial, so we're probably not the best people to ask. But yeah, there's nothing quite like what would have occurred in the old days that happens.
And a friend of mine also commented that her dad, who would have been Don Ellis, used to hold fish fries at the Anvil Inn
Oh, very cool.
I think every Friday. So that went on until 1976. But then after
Okay.
that, I'm not sure. I unfortunately didn't get to attend any fish fries during my time there. But she's also wondering if you have any history on the Anvil Inn or any stories on the Anvil Inn.
I know that we do have a file at the museum on the Anvil Inn. I ended up not doing a ton of research beyond kind of those early years, just because the railroad ended up taking so much of the book. But there's a whole lot more to explore in terms of the tourism era, which actually I think would be a great book for somebody to tackle, is that rise of Silvergate, and then Cooke also coming into that and really becoming more of a tourism force.
Great, thank you. I think
Someone
that would be
asks-
good.
Someone asks if Teddy Roosevelt had ever visited Cooke City.
He didn't, as far as I know. Probably because there was no railroad to get him.
That's how we got to Gardner. So yeah. Let's see. Well, here's an interesting one. This person says, I worked in Bozeman's Gallatin County nursing home in the 1970s. There was a gal there that was from the hills, had a shotgun wedding, and then aged to the point that all her people were gone. So someone brought her down to town to take care of her. She sat looking at the hills every day. Your personal story reminds me of her very fondly. Thanks for the presentation.
Oh, that's really cool.
Yeah.
I do wish so much that Anna Zucker died long before I ever could have met her, but that would have been amazing too. I mean, I'm sure there's still people like that also that you can glean those stories from, but yeah, she's a person that I would love to meet.
Here's another question. She says, years ago, I was told that the old mine remains off of the Round Lake Road was set up as a stock swindle, with the mine seeded and stock sold on that basis. Did you hear about this?
I haven't specifically, but I'm sure it happened. No doubt. It was pretty easy to be able to do that, being so far remote and everything, and being able to hightail it out. So yeah, I could see that happening.
It's great to see all of the questions and comments, Kelly.
Yeah.
People really engaged with your program.
And again, for all of you who wrote comments or questions, Kelly will be able to read these and see these as well later, and certainly all the great compliments. Someone says that Joan and Bill Humiston used to hold a fish fry at their Cooke Pass home in the 1960s.
She had the best pies. They were
Ah.
Yes, she did.
Great. Okay.
And there's one more question here. Tommy Garrison was apparently a miner before he became a hermit. Where did he mine, and is he in any of your photographs?
I'm not sure where he mined. A lot of that's actually a lot of those records are in Livingston. I did do a little bit of research, especially when I was so interested in the Zookers. And you can look up some mining records by last name and figure out sort of where things might be. Of course, then you got to be able to like read a map to figure out where everything's at. I found it quite difficult just because things changed so much since then. But that's definitely something that you can find out. I don't know if I had any photographs of him. I think it would have been maybe a little bit later. But we do, I know we have like these touch screens at the Cooke City Museum, and I believe that one of them talks about Tommy Garrison.
Well, very cool. Wonderful job. Kelly. And if there aren't any more questions, I think we'll sign off for this evening. Really appreciate you and your presentation and all of your knowledge, and also for all of you watching from home, as well as those of you who will be watching from YouTube after I get that posted to our YouTube channel. So thanks very much, and we will see you all hopefully next week, same time, just a week later. And yeah, thank you. Good night.
Good night.
Good night.